Good morning, good day. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tim Piotrowski from ASCM, and welcome to a discussion on a very important topic of building a circular supply chain. I'd like to take a moment to let the panel introduce themselves, starting with Cindy.
Thanks, Tim. So my name is Cindy Venho. I am a project manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in our network team, and we work with a number of businesses trying to help them overcome different challenges that they might be facing in becoming more circular. Worked on different types of projects, looking at the role of circular economy in tackling biodiversity loss and biomaterials, but most recently been examining what is the role of supply chain professionals in helping operationalize circular economy in their businesses, and worked with Deborah and Douglas on that. So I'm going to pass over to Deborah.
Perfect, thank you, Cindy. And music to my ears, talking about the relationship between supply chain and the circular economy, a space that I really tripped and fell into 6-ish years ago. And I haven't really looked back. This relationship is so fascinating to me. But the two communities haven't traditionally spent a lot of time together, the circularity community and the supply chain community. And it's because of that a few years ago, at the urging of several people I respect a lot, I started a small nonprofit called the Circular Supply Chain Network to create a space for supply chain professionals to come together without a paywall as individuals to nerd out on what does circularity mean for us and how can we help to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. And it's in that way that Cindy and I have had a chance to work together, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And certainly a space that I've been working with ASCM on the last couple of years, actually, as we look at what's the role of standards, what's the role of the skill sets we need to build as professionals. So by night, I lead this nonprofit. By day, I am the global supply chain sustainability leader at a company called Genpact, where I get the chance to work together with supply chains to operationalize their goals that they have set around circularity and materials use, carbon and sustainability. And it's a very, very interesting time to be in this space. Douglas, over to you, please.
Great. Well, thank you to you both. So Douglas Kent, Executive Vice President of our Corporate and Strategic Alliances here at the Association of Supply Chain Management. Speaking of here, I'm live from COP28, where obviously sustainability is a very hot topic. In fact, I think one will dig into a little bit deeper in terms of how does circularity overall fit into the arena of sustainability. So I feel like this is just an ongoing discussion amongst friends. So let's dig right in. So Cindy, maybe we start with you, because I know the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, part of that is really educating people on what circularity actually is. And you know, in the sustainability world, it's a bit like alphabet soup, you know, whether we're talking about GRI or we're talking about this or we're talking about that. A lot of acronyms get thrown out and a lot of misconceptions. So I know that EMF has worked on this sort of circularity diagram, if you will, trying to uncover a little bit of that mystery about what circularity is, and it just isn't about recycling and things that people might have at top of mind. So maybe we start with you first and just talk about what is the circular economy and what are some of the key tenets of that?
Absolutely, Douglas. Yes. So we often start by explaining that today we operate in a linear economy, which basically just means that we're taking a lot of resources from the ground, making products out of them, and then pretty soon afterwards, we're discarding them as waste. So it's a very extractive and polluting way of operating our economic system. And that's where the circular economy comes in as a solutions framework. And we really see it as driven by design around three principles. It's about eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and materials, and regenerating nature. And all of these principles kind of come to life a little more in the butterfly diagram that you alluded to, which I think we have a slide of that maybe we can pull up. But the butterfly diagram really showcases how materials flow in a circular economy. So we have on the right-hand side, we have what we call the technical cycle. And the left-hand side, we have what we call the biological cycle. Now, whether Materials flow in either side depend a little bit what they're designed for. So if a material has been designed to be safely returned to natural systems at the end of its use, it would fall into the biological cycle. So you can think about food, compostable materials as being good examples of that side. Whereas on the right-hand side, we'd see any more durable goods that you can reprocess, you can redistribute, and bring back into the economy multiple times. So here you see a number of loops starting with sharing, so reusing, then it's about maintenance, repair, remanufacture, and ultimately, as you say, Douglas, recycling. That really is part of the circular economy, but a more minor role than a lot of people, I think, assume. And the purpose of the diagram is really to show that the smaller the loop, the closer you keep it, the more embodied value and energy that's gone into the production of that good initially, you're able to retain. So it's really a way to generate environmental but also economic benefit by operating in this way.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because we're seeing the intersection between what happens in a design chain and what happens in a supply chain. And as Deborah, you alluded to earlier, those are communities that probably engineering and supply chain and those who might in effect be responsible for sustainability at large inside of an organization still somewhat sit in isolated silos to our own dismay and all of our joint efforts for educating. And we'll come to part of that relative to the most recently released white paper that we all worked on together. And I think, again, sort of distilling some of the mystery around that. Deborah, you worked in the space, you said 6.5 years. I feel like you were born into it. You're such a natural talent and really energizing this incredible community together. Give us your view on the circular supply chain at large and why now more than ever is it important that these conversations are happening, that all of the stakeholders are sitting at the table from private and public and governmental agencies working together to solve the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, some of this is going to feel more familiar than maybe it seems like it might on the surface when we think, okay, sustainability, what role do I really play as a supply chain professional? And the kicker, which Douglas just alluded to, is that everything that Cindy just showed about how do we repair more than we build new, how do we keep an item in use throughout a value chain for as long as possible, that's all us. So that's all our operations. It's us trying to figure out how to really optimize for asset use. And then ultimately, yes, harvesting the parts that we need for repair and refurbishment. So the instigation, of course, needs to be there. What I'm seeing is a few trends. We have had an immense amount of disruption across our globe and global supply chains these last few years. The joke that we've all made to each other, which is probably old by now, is that before COVID, nobody really knew what we did. And any of us in supply chain during those first couple of months, we had lots of phone calls from families saying, oh, is this what you actually do for a living? But it's during that time that it also really shone a light on the fragility of our global supply chains that work really well when we can predict what's needed around the world. We know more than we ever have about what consumers and users and businesses need on their demand signals. And we've gotten very, very efficient at supplying those needs, but usually at a relatively low margin. So as we start thinking about the role of supply chain and gaining margin, and there's obviously a couple ways that we can do that, it goes back to the butterfly diagram that Cindy showed. So the idea is the size of a circle also represents as a proxy the time and the effort and the distance and the steps and the people that you need to put into an item for somebody to get use out of it, for us to make money on it. So the bigger the circle or the loop is, the lower our margin likely is. So the best we can do for our business and supply chain is to keep those circles as small as possible. So as we go into the next couple of years, many predict some headwinds financially around the world. And so we'll be looking for cost savings opportunities. We're going to be looking for ways to remove risk and disruption out of our operations. We're seeing this shift already as a result of the disruptions the last couple of years in reshoring and friendshoring and moving operations closer to the point of use. because of course, the fewer miles we go, the less chances for disruption that we have. It's not always a perfect solution, and I know it's not as simple as it sounds, but that really encapsulates both the first principle of the circular economy about how do we use less to begin with, but it also helps unlock some of these ongoing lean classic wastes that we've sort of just lived with in our operations, and transportation being a big one of those. So how can we actually start to reimagine what it might look like to partner across our supply chains, find new partners, and be able to delight our customers in many more ways so that we can get through these couple of years ahead.
Yeah, I think, and Deborah, you said it very well. We've lived in the last 2 years. I mean, as securing as it is that now people know what supply chain is for those of us who work in the business, what's unprecedented is the amount of demand and supply shocks which have happened to the system, and really illuminating the lack of resiliency that we do have at large. And coupled with that, you have these macro factors. I mean, I can't be sitting at COP and not talk about, how is this impactful relative to climate change, and what's the importance of biodiversity? And it's certainly been a topic here in this session is really the importance of that. But I heard less about circularity playing a role in that, and that's sad, right? Because again, we're saying it kind of all starts from the initial design, and as Deborah, you're fond of saying, the recycling is the last point of defense, right? We don't want to get there. We do want to have that. So, Cindy, maybe from your perspective and for EMF's at large perspective, what is the role of circularity relative to its true impact on climate change, and why is it so important that we move forward faster on these initiatives and we do bring these communities together to thoughtfully have the discussions which are necessary to drive change?
Yeah, you're right, Douglas, that often we do see that, we're talking about climate issues and we're talking about biodiversity issues and completely separate conversations around circular economy, that the things are not meeting in the way that we'd like them to. And there is a large role that the circular economy can play in actually helping us address a lot of these global challenges. So in terms of climate, referring to COP as you're there is a paper that we put out in 2019 called Completing the Picture, where we did a modeling exercise because we noticed that in the climate space, we talk a lot about renewable energy and energy efficiency. And while these are absolutely core components, if we're going to reduce our impact on climate change, we also are missing a huge part of the picture if we don't think about the material story. So we found that about 45% of the emissions globally come from more or less our consumption and production of goods. And so in order to address that, we need circular economy to be able to rethink the ways that we're producing these goods today. And so from our modeling exercise, we found that if you were to just transition using some CE levers across 4 key industries like steel, aluminium, cement, you could reduce actually your emissions by 40% compared to the baseline scenario in 2050. So definite clear connections between CE solutions and climate. And similarly, to your point around biodiversity loss, we also found that, the IRP reports that over 90% of biodiversity loss comes from the way that we produce and consume goods in our economies. And again, conservation restoration efforts, these are critical in our attempt to bend the curve of that loss. But if we don't address how we're today making these goods and using them, that won't be enough. And so for that, we see that if you're applying, again, the 3 principles, you can see that if you're eliminating waste and pollution, you can reduce your threats to biodiversity. If you're circulating products and materials, you can leave more room for biodiversity because you're reducing your virgin material consumption. And by regenerating nature, you're actively able to actually create a positive impact on a lot of the agroecosystems that we rely on for our food and a number of materials. So there's connections into the nature space as well by applying circular economy that you can see how that can benefit that challenge too.
Yeah, and I think we're going to return back to that subject on the utilization of virgin materials, because I think that's absolutely critical as a component, is actually to measure that, which is super important. Deborah, maybe turning back to the challenges, right? So we all talk about it. We can't convince ourselves, but we do need to convince others. We need to convince other stakeholders, people that perhaps don't have the same level of understanding. Whenever we're together and we're talking about it, I'm fond of saying, how do we move from aspiration to operationalizing it into where these decisions are at the forefront of the everyday worker in terms of what we do and the decisions that we take. And it's not really a trade-off, but rather actually part of our DNA. But we're not there. We are very high on aspiration. I mean, certainly I've been listening to it for 5 days now. Countries, you have companies making aspirations for achieving certain goals. But when you talk to the everyday supply chain professional, they don't know what that means. So Deborah, you're an advocate. You see firsthand the challenges for adoption within the space. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges and maybe provide any insights on how to overcome these challenges so that we, again, can move forward faster on our agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always love that aspiration to operations. And operations is, of course, what we spend most of our time thinking about in supply chain. And so one small plug, we've mentioned it, but I'll plug it a little bit more firmly. We have jointly together with Ellen MacArthur Foundation just released a white paper on building a circular supply chain, which is the name of this session right now. And in that, while we thought about how do we best speak into the hearts of supply chain professionals to explain how is this different than what we're doing today, which is one part of it, but the other part is we are natural risk managers in supply chains. We're always trying to figure out what's going to go wrong so we can make sure it doesn't, so that nobody ever knows we exist because we did such a good job. And so we just sit around and work really hard, and now everybody knows who we are. So part of this was sitting together with the supply chains who have successfully or otherwise tried to implement some level of circularity through their operations. What's really interesting is that sometimes we've been doing this without realizing we've been doing this. So if you have a returns and repair and refurb and reman operation, you are participating in a circular economy. So all of the best practices that go into keeping an item in use are really what we're showcasing. So the good news is we kind of already know what we're talking about, but we don't have the shared language, which is where I'm so thrilled about the involvement of ASCM in this as we look to establish global standards for us to be able to accelerate together. So challenges. Some of these challenges, and there's 9 challenges we list in the white paper. There's also a very simple, beautiful fact sheet if you don't want to spend time reading the paper, but there are a lot of really good examples throughout it. Some will feel similar to what you would expect as a category. So it might say, wow, finance is a challenge, but dig into the details a little, because as we start imagining, I usually say everything is inventory. And in this case, it's actually more like everything is an asset. How do we treat it not like a one-time piece of inventory to optimize and put through our systems as fast as possible? And turns today is how many of us look at what defines good or a healthy supply chain. And instead, we start to imagine everything as a reusable asset that we want to drive utilization. So it's not necessarily through a system as much as it is in the hands of a user. That's going to cause havoc on the way that we financially track our supply chains. And so sitting together with our finance teams is really important, which should come as no surprise. They're usually our first stop anyway if we want to go and change something. We might also see something around network design. Now, again, you might say we've been working on optimizing our networks for years. This is nothing that's new. But if we start to imagine we now are adding new types of suppliers and new types of customers. So we're wanting to get our inputs from someplace that's not the planet, which means we may need to reconsider how we stay close to the point of use so that we can get our product back, or so that we can get a similar enough product back. And again, the role of standards so that we can actually do a little co-opetition and everybody does better together because we have some level of reusability. Also, interestingly, if we pause reality for a second and imagine we're in 100% perfect circular economy, it means we get zero from the planet, which means that we have to source everything we get from another supply chain. So that means we now need better types of connectivity. We need better types of supply signals that might help us shape some demand based off of what's available. It also means that our networks may start to feel challenged. We may imagine moving away from a centralized mega factory or a mega distribution center to many, many shared nodes that are closer to point of use. And so we start thinking about how difficult it is to even execute a single return with our current ERP systems, often very, very difficult to do. And we're saying, look, that's basically going to be 100% of our lives now. So we tried to approach this. It is an introductory to this topic, but we also try to be very pragmatic and say this is very difficult. We've been spending almost 100 years trying to perfect the linear economy. So keep it in mind that when you hit a wall, which you will, there are very smart of our operations forefathers who have tried to make unbreakable processes to perfect and optimize a linear economy. So as we try to steer this shift, I know we can do it, but have a look at these challenges. Certainly reach out to any of us as you start down this path with your own organization, with your own partners. And the biggest why to do this is because there are margin savings here for you to use this as a strategy to get to the service levels and margin goals that you have this next year. So as you're hitting your head against a wall saying, I don't know where else to find the money, I have to save 10 or 15% this year, I don't know where to look, try imagining some of these tools and to look at your supply chain and operations in a new way. And I think it can be a real unlock.
Yeah, and just for the audience purposes, when Deborah was speaking about forefathers, she wasn't talking about me. She was. But couple quick points. So one, you referenced the white paper. We're going to hit that in a second. There'll be a QR code at the end of today's session for you to be able to download that. And also please look at the other resources that Cindy mentioned on the EMF website as well. A lot of information available in addition to the white paper from that standpoint. And then Deborah, you mentioned this, we've been doing optimization for a very long time. The reality of that is until very, very recently, it was a two-pronged trade-off in optimization. It was cost and service. Sustainability was not part of the optimization trade-off that is made when deciding what the supply chain network design was, deciding who our suppliers were, taking a look at the opportunity that Cindy mentioned about being able to reuse rather than purchase virgin. That those were not, they simply were not part of the equation until recently. So we've taken a little bit of that on board from ASCM standpoint, and I welcome both of your comments relative to this. In the recent release of the SCOR model, maybe we can pop that up on the screen, really tried to give the community reference points around these key concepts, and particularly around what we call OE13, which is the circular supply chain, which is a new addition to the SCOR model and heavily leveraged and referenced in the white paper that we mentioned, and that you'll have that link to. But I think this is critically important to start to develop standards, to start to develop measures within the SCOR model, which is, as most people know, the most prolifically used model for designing and redesigning and measuring the success of your supply chain. More than 5,000 organizations worldwide have used the SCOR model since its inception in 1997. So having circularity at the forefront in bringing that into this orchestration bubble and this very dynamic, non-linear supply chain was certainly, critically important in the redesign and the release of the SCOR model. So the link I think you see in the chat here, please feel free to download it. One of our big decisions inside of ASCM is to make all of our standards, including the SCOR model, all of our frameworks freely available to anyone in the world. Not tethered or complicated by being a member of the organization. So please take advantage of the SCOR model, and please don't just read the cheat sheet on the white paper. Do take the time to download that and read the full scale of that. I think that's certainly important. I know we're starting to get towards the end of our session, but Cindy, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the community that you as EMF have put together. You have some amazing corporate participants, et cetera. So just talk to us a little bit about how important it is to bring that stakeholder group together, but also from a government standpoint as well, because I think what we rapidly see happen is if our adoption is lagging, regulation will follow. And it's harder and more expensive once that hits. So Cindy, maybe just talk a little bit about the view from your multitude of stakeholders in your community, and how together they're working to try to drive the agenda forward quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. We always say that collaboration really is very key in any kind of circular economy solutions that you're trying to drive, whether you're a business or a policymaker. And that's collaboration on a lot of different levels. So what Deborah was alluding to in her description as well was, you need this different types of collaborations across your value chain, across industries. You might be, as you're adopting circularity in the way that you manage supply chains, you have to be thinking about different ways of partnering with completely different entities to what you might have today. Equally, it's about internal collaboration. So that was also mentioned earlier, this need to talk to your finance team, but also, you need to design products that will more effectively fit into your circular supply chain now. So if you're not designing a product to be returned, it's going to be a lot harder to capture that value optimally. Similarly, if you don't have a business model that is driving the return, but is more predicated on a singular sale, it's going to be harder for you to drive this return. So a lot of internal teams need to also come together to be able to help you make this transition more effectively and generate all those benefits that you're looking to get in terms of value retention, but also in terms of the climate benefit or biodiversity benefit. And then there is obviously this angle of public versus private collaboration. Which can be difficult, right? We work with policymakers and we work with businesses, and we can feel a tension sometimes in that, policymakers obviously have a really big say in that if new legislation comes out, businesses have to respond to it. It's, we're seeing that a lot with even the ESRS coming out, a lot of different pieces of legislation. But at the same time, policymakers also look to businesses to send signals of what is possible and what is the interest of these stakeholders too in how they develop legislation. So we have a lot of work where we bring together, for instance, in plastic space now, a business coalition to bring these businesses and amplify their voices so that they can influence legislation in terms of telling them what is important to them and how can they influence that group to change the rules of the game in a way to make circularity easier for them to adopt. So it's a bit of a dual street, and I think that's the main thing is everyone just coming to the table and being willing to work together in quite different ways than we might be today, but that's really the only way that we're going to push this most effectively.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it is so important, and we'll start to close out on this subject because I think amplifying the voice is critical to the equation, Cindy, as you mentioned. Why don't we go ahead and put the QR code so people can have the opportunity to download the white paper. But also, I want the audience to understand that we believe that showcasing some of the successes is paramount to getting that stakeholder community brought closer together. We've agreed to put together a working group, a community of practice that will focus on both, how to get this done, how to overcome some of the challenges that Deborah mentioned earlier, how to leverage some of the resources that EMF provides, how to translate the SCOR model into what you're doing, those kinds of things, and also just showcasing success. So you'll hear more from us in the new year about the working group, and be very excited to have some of the audience today participate in that for sure. So I know we can talk forever on this. It's such an important subject and we deserve to talk forever on this. I hope we won't have to talk forever on this, but maybe just a couple of quick points. So again, please take advantage of the resources from the three communities represented here today. Take a chance to read the white paper. Send us your comments. And when you hear the announcement about the working group in the first quarter of next year, then please take the opportunity to join. Last chance of words of wisdom. What does 2050 look like for you, Deborah?
2050, Douglas, we're going to pull that right in and say 2030.
Perfect. Love it.
We'll all have access to the repair facilities that we need. Instead of having one-to-one relationships with our repair vendors, we're going to be able to work more seamlessly with them like we do with our forward supply chain. Maybe 2030 is not the right date. Maybe 2035, we're going to start hitting a tipping point where we're going to start repairing more than we build new. And you're going to say that's crazy. And I'm going to say you're right. The goal really is 1 in 5. Analysis shows from a carbon, climate, resources perspective, if we can get to 1 in 5, we'll do ourselves some massive favors in trying to avert crisis. So think about 1.5. 1 in 5 items needs to be repaired or reused. If you're in the world where your product is consumed and that seems really hard, think about pallets. Start with the pallets you use all the time and imagine rotating to something that can be reused throughout your supply chain. Try this on as a different type of an innovation lens with your team sometime, and come back to us and let us know how it's going to work for you.
Great. And Cindy, from you, what's the secret sauce to success here?
Secret sauce. I'm going to go back to collaboration, and experimentation is another big thing. So I think to what Deborah was saying, you know, you need to have a certain level of bravery to go out there and experiment with things that you might not be doing today, or with other organizations or people within your organization who you might not be working with today. So really getting stuck in and, you know, just going for it has a lot of merit to it. But yeah, work with each other, talk to each other. We'll all learn from each other.
Yeah, I love that, and not try to boil the ocean, even though I'm surrounded by water conservation people here today. But in any case, I think it's great, get that proof of concept and celebrate every one of those successes. So Deborah from Atlanta, Cindy from the Isle of Wight, good to spend the time with you and talk about this critically important subject. Thank you for all of that you do individually and as your organizations. We look forward as ASCM to continue our collaboration together and really make a difference in the world through supply chain. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you, and thanks, Douglas.